At 8:30 a.m. on Friday, July 18, 2014, 41-year-old law school professor Dan Markle drove his two young sons to a preschool in an upscale neighborhood in Tallahassee, Florida. It was already a hot summer day, and it was only going to get hotter with temperatures set to go over 90 degrees Fahrenheit by the afternoon. So Dan decided to let the boys in on a surprise he'd been planning. He glanced back at his sons sitting in their car seats and said when he picked them up after school, they could go right to the pool and spend the rest of the day swimming. The boys got so excited, it sounded like Dan had just told them they were going to Disney World. Dan laughed and then drove a little further down the road, turned into the preschool parking lot, and parked his black Honda Accord. Then he stepped outside, helped his boys out of the car, and walked them both up to the door of the school where one of their teachers was waiting. Dan crouched down, gave each of the boys a hug, and told them he loved them and to have a great day. Once the boys were inside, Dan turned around and headed back to the parking lot and got into his car. Dan was average height with short brown hair and a beard, and he wore glasses. And today he was dressed for the gym in a red t-shirt and black shorts. But before he went for his workout that morning, he knew there was a phone call he needed to make. So he grabbed his cell phone from the pocket of his shorts, pulled up his contact list on the screen, and stared at the name Wendy. Dan let out a long sigh and his mind started to wander. Wendy Adelson was Dan's ex-wife. They had been divorced for a year and had been separated for almost 2 years, but there were still days when Dan couldn't believe the two of them were not together anymore. Dan and Wendy had met on a dating website 10 years earlier. At the time, Dan had been a law school professor at a university in Washington, D.C., and Wendy was a law student at the University of Miami in South Florida. And soon after they'd exchanged a few messages on the dating site, Wendy had decided she wanted to meet Dan face-to-face, so she hopped on a plane and flew to D.C. And the two of them hit it off in person just as much as they had online. Wendy was totally taken by Dan's incredible intelligence, and she could tell he was driven and that he had a bright career ahead of him. And right after Dan had met Wendy, he told a friend he felt like he'd won the lottery. Wendy was about 7 years younger than Dan, and she was beautiful with long curly brown hair and blue eyes. She had grown up wealthy, but never really talked about money. Instead, she just talked about how important her parents and her older brother Charlie were to her. And Dan loved that, because he thought family was the only thing more important than work or money. And Dan also loved that even though Wendy was studying to become a lawyer just like he was, she was a lot more fun and more of a free spirit than most of his colleagues in the legal profession were. Wendy had dreams of writing a novel, she had been a contestant on the TV game show The Weakest Link, and she'd even considered joining the circus at one point. And Dan felt like Wendy was a breath of fresh air in his relatively routine life. And by the time Wendy had flown back home to Florida a few days later, both of them were already convinced they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. And so not long after that first meeting, Dan took a teaching position at Florida State University in Tallahassee, and Wendy joined him there when she finished law school. And then, just 8 months after they had first met, Dan and Wendy were engaged. Even now, sitting in his car in the preschool parking lot and staring at Wendy's name on his phone, Dan could still remember how stunning she had looked when she walked down the aisle in her white dress at their wedding, almost like she was glowing. And for a time back then, Dan couldn't believe how lucky he was to have a wife like Wendy and how great his life had turned out. And things had only gotten better when Wendy gave birth to their 2 sons a little over a year apart. And at least for a while, Wendy had seemed really happy too. She'd gotten a teaching job at Florida State, and she, Dan, and their boys would often drive almost 7 hours south to spend time with Wendy's parents and her brother Charlie, so Wendy still felt connected to her own family. But back in the car, Dan felt like his and Wendy's wedding, their first meeting in D.C., and his relationship with Wendy's family were all now ancient history. He was never quite sure why their marriage had actually fallen apart, but he was working hard now not to dwell on the past and to try to be happy in the present. Dan took a deep breath and finally called Wendy. He got her voicemail, so he left her a message reminding her he was leaving town soon for an academic conference, so they would need to work out their custody schedule with their boys. Dan and Wendy had joint custody of their kids, but they made accommodations for each other when one of them had to travel for work. Dan hung up and tossed his phone onto the passenger seat. Then he pulled his car out of the parking lot and drove off towards the gym, which was only a few minutes away. And as he looked out his windshield at the trees outside and the sun shining, he reminded himself that he had a fun day planned for him and his sons, and that even if his life was not perfect anymore, it was still pretty great. Dan worked out at the gym for over an hour that morning, and then he walked outside at about 10:45 a.m. He got into his car and drove off, and a few minutes later, he arrived in his neighborhood that was lined with large two-story homes with well-manicured lawns out front. Then, just before Dan pulled onto his street, he remembered he had to make another phone call. His oldest son was about to start taking piano lessons, and Dan had told Wendy that he would set everything up. So he grabbed his phone and he called the piano teacher. And the two men were still talking when Dan actually pulled into his driveway. Dan reached up and pushed the garage door opener that was clipped to his sun visor, waited for the door to open, and then pulled his car into the garage. Dan left the car running and the garage door open while he sat in his car and kept talking to the piano teacher. But then suddenly, Dan saw something move in his rearview mirror. He turned to look back and asked the piano teacher to hold on for a second, and then Dan saw someone walking towards his car. Dan turned and looked out the driver's side window to get a better look at this person, but before Dan could say anything, he heard a sound like a firecracker going off. Then Dan's ears started ringing, his vision blurred, and he fell forward against the steering wheel. At 10:50 a.m., about the time Dan had pulled his car into the garage, a married couple in their 70s were sitting on their living room couch in the house next door to Dan's. The couple had just gotten a new iPad, and they were spending a relaxing morning figuring out all of the features it had to offer. Then they heard the loud popping sound coming from the house next door. The man got off the couch and rushed over to the large bay window in the living room. He looked outside and saw a light-colored car peeling out of Dan's driveway. He looked at his wife and he said he wanted to see what was going on and that he was worried someone might have broken into Dan's house and just driven off. His wife told him to please be careful, and the man said he would be, and then he stepped outside. The sun was bright and he shielded his eyes to block the glare as he walked across his lawn towards Dan's driveway. And as he got closer, he heard the sound of a car running. And then when he looked into the garage, he saw Dan's black Honda Accord parked there. So this man figured he must have just misunderstood what had just happened. If Dan was parked in the garage, someone would not have been robbing his house, and the light-colored car might have just backfired and made the sound he had just heard. So the neighbor turned around, walked back to his house and into his living room, but instead of rejoining his wife on the couch, he went back to the window and stared out at Dan's driveway. He just wanted to wait and see Dan pull out of the garage or close the garage door, and that way he would be sure everything really was okay. But after a few minutes, the garage door was still open and Dan's car was still inside. The man leaned up against his window, squinted, and tried to see if there was any movement next door inside the house, but nothing was happening, and he started to get an uneasy feeling in his stomach. So he told his wife he was going to go back outside again to actually go check on Dan. This time, the neighbor moved quickly across his yard to Dan's driveway, and he could hear the car still running. He called out to Dan as he turned the corner, but nobody replied. Then he stepped into the garage, and immediately he stopped in his tracks. He felt broken glass crunch under his feet, and he knew something had to be wrong. The man rushed to Dan's driver's side window, and he gasped. Almost all of the glass in the window had shattered, and in the car, he saw Dan's body slumped over the wheel. The neighbor shouted Dan's name several times, but Dan didn't respond. So the man leaned in closer to the shattered window and he saw blood in Dan's hair and on his face, but he could see that Dan was still breathing. So the man turned around and ran back to his house as fast as he could. He threw the front door open, grabbed his phone in the living room, and he dialed 911. When the operator picked up, the man told him that they needed urgent help at the house next door. He said his neighbor was bleeding from his head, but he was still breathing. But for some reason, the operator asked the neighbor a bunch of questions about what specifically he had seen that had prompted him to call 911. The neighbor didn't understand what was happening. He just kept saying that his neighbor was slumped over in his car, there was blood in his hair and on his face, and they needed to help him right now. Finally, the operator said yes, they would send someone over. At that point, the neighbor hung up, ran back outside, and rushed over to Dan's garage again. He leaned into the shattered window and tried to talk to Dan. Dan didn't respond, but the neighbor could see Dan was still alive and breathing. The neighbor's hands were shaking and he kept looking out at the street. He didn't understand why it was taking so long for an ambulance to arrive. Then finally, over 15 minutes after he'd called 911, the neighbor heard a siren approaching. But when he walked out of the garage and looked down the street, he saw a police car, not an ambulance. The police car parked in front of the house, and as soon as the officer stepped out, the neighbor ran towards him and waved him to come into the garage. And when the police officer saw Dan slumped over in the car struggling to breathe, he didn't understand why he had been the one dispatched to the scene instead of an ambulance. So he called the station and said they needed an ambulance immediately, and then after that, the officer reached into Dan's car and shut off the engine. Then, finally, a few minutes later, an ambulance did arrive, and Dan was rushed off to the hospital. But as Dan's neighbor listened to the ambulance siren fade into the distance, he worried that the few minutes he'd waited before calling 911, and then all the confusion that had occurred with the emergency operator, had cost Dan so much time and quite possibly his life. At around noon that day, less than an hour after the ambulance arrived at Dan's house, Detective Craig Issam of the Tallahassee Police drove through a wealthy neighborhood, and he saw kids who were off from school for the summer laughing and playing in their front yards. But as Issam turned onto Dan Street, the flashing lights from squad cars and the yellow crime scene tape around Dan's house painted a very different picture. He parked his car in the line of cop cars on the street, looked out the window, and saw several officers moving in and out of Dan's open garage. Issam knew some people thought bad things never happened in upscale neighborhoods like this one, but he'd been a cop for 25 years, and so he knew bad things could happen anywhere. Issam stepped out of the car and walked up Dan's driveway. He was a stocky man with short-cropped gray hair, and today he wore a black golf shirt tucked into khaki pants. Detective Issam took off his sunglasses and stepped into the garage, where the first officers who'd arrived at the scene were looking at Dan's parked car. There was glass all over the ground, and Issam saw the driver's side window was almost completely shattered. And when he looked in the car, he saw a broken pair of eyeglasses on the floorboard. All Issam knew about the scene was that Dan Markle, a well-respected law school professor, had been found slumped over in this car with bullet wounds in his head, and that he had been taken to the hospital. Issam talked briefly with the other officers on the scene, and he learned that when they had checked the house, there was no signs of struggle or forced entry. He also learned that the next-door neighbor was the one who had found Dan and called 911. So, while the officers continued to photograph the scene inside of the garage and dust Dan's car for fingerprints, Issam walked next door and found Dan's neighbor still standing outside. Issam smiled and told the man he'd just like to ask him some questions, and the man said he wanted to help in any way he could. Then, the man relayed his version of events from the time he'd heard the popping sound next door and gone to look out the window. And as Issam listened, one thing jumped out at him: the car the man had seen peeling out of the driveway. But this neighbor had not gotten a license plate number, and he could only say it looked like a pretty common car that was a light color. With that description, Issam knew finding the specific car might end up being impossible, but at least it was something to go on. Issam also learned from the neighbor that Dan had 2 young sons and an ex-wife named Wendy Adelson. Issam had no idea whether Wendy was connected to the car that had driven off from Dan's house, but in cases like this, the ex-spouse was almost always the first person to talk to. So Issam thanked the man for his help and then walked back to Dan's garage. By this point, police had gotten word from the hospital that Dan was not going to survive, and they would later learn that Dan had never regained consciousness at the hospital and he had died at around 1 p.m. Issam also found out that for some reason, the 911 operator had not made the call from Dan's neighbor a high-priority response. Issam didn't know if a faster emergency response would have saved Dan's life, but when he heard the news that Dan wasn't going to make it, his first thoughts were of Dan's sons. Dwelling on the 911 call wouldn't change the fact that 2 young boys would now have to grow up without their father, and that hit Issam very hard. And that news also made it very important for him to talk to Dan's ex-wife as soon as possible. Regardless of her potential involvement in what happened to Dan, she would still have to tell her sons that their father was now dead. So Issam walked back to his car, left the scene of the crime, and started looking for Wendy. At around 2:30 p.m., about 3.5 hours after the 911 call, Detective Issam pulled into the parking lot of a high-end shopping center. With the help of cell phone and GPS data, police had tracked Wendy down to a popular restaurant that was there. Issam got out of his car, walked into the restaurant, and scanned the tables. He spotted Wendy sitting with 2 other women. She was 35 years old, and she wore a dark blue t-shirt with a print on it and blue shorts. And she had her hair pulled up in a bun with her sunglasses perched on top. Issam stood there and watched Wendy for a few moments. She was talking with her friends and laughing, and so on the surface, she did not appear to have any idea about what had just happened to her ex-husband, but Issam knew that didn't necessarily mean she was totally innocent. Some people were just really good at hiding things. So Issam made his way over to their table, and right away the 3 women stopped what they were doing and looked up at him. He smiled and said he was sorry to interrupt their lunch, but that he needed to speak to Wendy Adelson. Wendy immediately put her hand up and had a very confused look on her face. Then Issam showed her his badge and told her he needed to talk to her at the station about an incident that had occurred that morning. And the look of confusion on Wendy's face turned to fear, and she wanted to know if her children were all right. Issam assured her her children were fine, and then he asked her to come to the station again. Wendy looked at her friends nervously, and then she grabbed her purse and followed Detective Issam out of the restaurant. Once they were outside, Wendy climbed into Issam's car, and the 2 of them rode the 10 minutes to the police station in almost complete silence. When they arrived at the police station, another officer led Wendy into a small interrogation room where she took a seat at a wooden table. Even after being outside in the Florida sun, the light in the room seemed bright and glaring to Wendy. A few minutes later, Issam walked in carrying a small notebook and a pen. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Wendy at the table. Right away, Wendy wanted to know what was going on and why she'd been brought here. So Issam told her that earlier that morning, her ex-husband, Dan, had been shot and killed in his car while he was parked in the garage. Wendy immediately burst into tears and buried her face in her hands and kept saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." Then, at some point, Wendy looked up at Issam and something in her eyes changed, like the lawyer in her had suddenly kicked in. She told the detective she understood why she was here, she was a suspect, but she said she had nothing to do with whatever happened to Dan. Issam told her he was just trying to get a better understanding of what might have happened, and Wendy nodded and then took a deep breath. Then Issam asked her where she had been that day before she went to the restaurant where he'd found her with her friends. She said she'd been at home in the morning, had gone to the liquor store to buy a gift for a housewarming party, and then she went right to the restaurant. Issam scribbled notes in his notebook, looked up at Wendy again, and asked her if there was anyone she could think of who would have wanted to hurt Dan. But Wendy shook her head. She said Dan could be a tough professor and difficult to get along with at work because he was a perfectionist, but she couldn't imagine any of his students or colleagues doing something like this. So Issam asked Wendy about their divorce, and she told him it had gotten pretty ugly at first, and that Dan had not been the easiest person to be married to. But then she told him that she and Dan had been really working hard to get along better for the sake of their sons. Then suddenly a look of panic came across Wendy's face. She remembered Dan was supposed to pick up the kids at school, and now they'd be left there alone. And when she mentioned her sons, she started crying again. Issam tried to comfort her and told her they would make sure the kids were okay, and he asked her if there were friends the police could call to make sure someone was at the school when the boys got out. Wendy took another deep breath, then grabbed her phone out of her pocket and scrolled through her contacts to get Issam a list of names and phone numbers. Issam said making sure the boys were taken care of was his top priority, so he got up from the table, crossed the room, and stepped out into the hall. And once he was out there, he asked an officer to call the list of Wendy's friends she had just given him to see if one of them could pick the boys up. And then Issam just waited and left Wendy alone in the interrogation room. During his time as a lead investigator, Issam had conducted his fair share of interrogations, and there were plenty of times he could pretty much immediately get a read on someone he was interrogating. Other times, though, people were just too hard to understand, and right now he wasn't quite sure about Wendy. He believed she was grieving, and he believed her story about where she had been that morning, but he felt like she just wasn't telling him everything. He thought that could just be the lawyer in her, or maybe she was in shock, or maybe she really was hiding something. About 40 minutes went by, and Issam got word that officers had contacted one of Wendy's friends who said she'd pick the boys up at preschool. Issam thanked the officer and then headed back into the interrogation room, determined to get as much information from Wendy as possible. So, again, he took a seat across from Wendy and then told her which friend was going to get the boys, at which point Wendy breathed a huge sigh of relief and thanked him. Then Issam looked her in the eye and asked her if there was someone in hers or Dan's life that maybe she hadn't thought about who could possibly want to harm Dan. At first, Wendy kind of laughed and joked that during the divorce, some of her family probably wanted to punch Dan on more than one occasion, but that was just because they loved her. But then, Wendy stopped laughing, and she got a serious look on her face. She covered her mouth with her hand, and her eyes went wide. Then she looked across the table at Issam, lowered her hand, and said something had just hit her. There was somebody she hadn't thought about who hated Dan. Her most recent ex-boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse. Issam wrote Jeff's name down in his notebook, then he asked why Wendy thought Jeff might have a problem with Dan. And she said that she and Jeff had only been dating for a few months when Jeff started getting really jealous of any other man that she talked to. And she said Jeff couldn't stand Dan for that reason, and that Jeff had a bit of a temper. Then Issam asked what kind of car Jeff drove, and Wendy said a silver Nissan Sentra. Issam jotted that down in his notebook. A silver Nissan Sentra could fit the description of the car that Dan's neighbor had seen speeding away from the house. Issam thanked Wendy for all her help, and after 5 hours, her interview was finally over. Issam was a long way from ruling Wendy out as a suspect, but for right now, he really wanted to go talk to her ex-boyfriend, Jeff. After Detective Issam met with Wendy, police contacted her ex-boyfriend, Jeff, who was also a professor at Florida State. Jeff agreed to meet with police, and they arranged for him to come to the station on the afternoon of Monday, July 21st, which would be 3 days after Dan's murder. But on the morning of July 20th, so a day before Issam and his team would meet with Jeff, they walked into a local synagogue and stood at the back for Dan's memorial service. At the service, Issam was struck by the number of Dan's former students who spoke about how much Dan had helped them in school, and how his willingness to push them to always do better had helped them achieve more than they thought possible. But it was the end of the memorial service that would stick in Issam's mind for years to come. Dan's mom stood at the front of the synagogue and spoke about how much she loved her son, and how much he had meant to so many people, not only at Florida State, but to the Jewish community throughout Tallahassee. And then, through tears, she invited Wendy and the boys to come join her. Wendy, along with her boys, made her way to the front of the synagogue and listened to her former mother-in-law talk about how much Dan's children had meant to him. And while this happened, Detective Issam listened to people seated throughout the synagogue start to cry. Then he saw Wendy's mom stand up, cross in front of Wendy's dad and brother Charlie, and make her way to the very front as well. And there, she promised Dan's mom, as one grandmother to another, that Dan's family would always have a place in Dan's sons' lives. Issam left the memorial service, and he was taken by how many people that single act of violence in Dan's garage had affected. And as he drove away, he was determined to find out who had pulled the trigger, and he hoped Wendy's ex-boyfriend would help him get closer to the truth. The next day, on the afternoon of July 21st, Jeff Lacasse sat behind a wooden table in an interrogation room just like the one Wendy had been in. Jeff was 42 years old, and he was thin, with brown hair and a beard. He wore a t-shirt and jeans, and he wore glasses. When Jeff had first arrived at the station, Detective Issam had been surprised by how much he looked just like Dan. Issam stayed outside of the room and watched on a camera feed as another investigator stepped into the interrogation room first and took a seat at the table across from Jeff. Even before the investigator started talking, Jeff started fidgeting in his chair and tapping his fingers on the table like he couldn't sit still. Then, the investigator asked Jeff if there was anything he could tell them about Dan and Wendy. Jeff smiled and said he could tell them a lot. Looking at the screen, Issam got the sense that he wasn't really watching an interview. He was watching a guy get everything off his chest he'd ever wanted to say about his ex-girlfriend. Without prompting, Jeff gave a very long monologue about his and Wendy's relationship and how he still loved her, even though he knew she didn't love him. He barely stopped to take a breath, and he used his hands to accentuate certain points in the story. Jeff admitted that he did not like Dan because, as Wendy's ex-husband, Dan was always going to be in their lives, and he complained that at Florida State, Dan was one of those professors who thought he was smarter than everyone else, and that totally rubbed Jeff the wrong way. But despite all that, Jeff said he would never do anything to Dan. The idea of shooting someone was completely foreign to him, and he said he had been in Tennessee on the day of the murder, and he could give police the names of a bunch of people who would vouch for him. But even after Jeff had offered a potential alibi, he kept talking, and as Issam continued to watch from outside the room, he couldn't believe how much Jeff was willing to say without even being asked. and at times, Issam couldn't tell if he was watching a man put on an act or if he was watching someone who just really had nothing to hide. But then, during a rant about how sometimes he felt like Wendy wasn't being completely honest with him, Jeff said something that stunned Issam and the investigator who was actually in the room. The investigator put up his hands and asked Jeff to stop talking for a second, and then asked Jeff to repeat what he had just said. Jeff laughed a little, caught his breath, and repeated himself. And when Issam heard what Jeff had to say again, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And what Jeff had said would make Issam look at the case in a completely different way than he had in the first few days of the investigation. And Issam's new approach to the case would eventually help police find that mysterious car that had peeled out of Dan's driveway, and that would lead them to who had killed Dan. Some elements of Dan Markel's murder are still under investigation and pending trial. But, based on interviews, evidence at the crime scene, and surveillance camera footage, this is a reconstruction of the police's leading theory about what happened to Dan on July 18, 2014. A little before 8:30 a.m. on July 18th, the killers sat in a light green Toyota Prius vehicle on the street a few houses down from Dan's house. They were calm, and each one knew their role. The driver would make sure they never lost sight of Dan, and the shooter, who was sitting in the passenger seat with a Smith & Wesson revolver in their hand, would pull the trigger when the time came. Then the killers watched as Dan's garage door opened, and they watched him pull out onto the street with his two sons in the backseat of the car. The driver waited a few seconds and then followed Dan. The driver wound his way through the neighborhood, keeping Dan in their sights without getting too close to his car, like a hunter stalking their prey. And when Dan pulled into a preschool parking lot, the driver found a spot on the street to park and wait. Finally, after Dan had walked the kids up to the school, gone back to his car, and made a phone call, the killers watched him drive back onto the road, and they followed him. They still didn't feel like they were in a hurry, and they never panicked. They knew what their goal was, and they would wait until the perfect moment arrived. So when Dan drove to the gym and went inside to work out, the driver just found a parking spot outside a few spaces away from Dan's car, and the killers waited again. While Dan was in the gym, the killers, sitting in the car, just talked and joked as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. And then, after they'd been sitting there for over half an hour, the driver backed out of the parking spot, drove around the lot, and found a new spot. The driver didn't want anyone who had seen the car while walking into the gym to see the car still there when they walked out. Then, after over an hour had passed since Dan had gone into the gym, the driver spotted Dan again, walking out of the gym and back to his car. And at this point, the killers felt like they were getting close. Their sense of anticipation was starting to grow. The killers followed as Dan drove out of the gym parking lot and back into his neighborhood. And as they approached Dan's street, the killers saw Dan make another phone call. Then, at about 10:50 a.m., almost 2.5 hours after the killers had first started tailing him, Dan had arrived home and pulled his car into the garage. At this point, the killers pulled into the driveway and parked the Prius. Then the shooter opened the passenger door, stepped outside, and crossed in front of the Prius. They saw Dan glancing back at them from his own car, so they rushed into the garage before Dan could have a chance to close the door. Then the shooter walked within 2 feet of the driver's side window and saw Dan turning towards them, still holding his phone. So the killer took a breath, raised the gun, and fired. Glass from the window shattered, and the killer threw their arm up to protect their face. The .38 caliber bullet had struck Dan in the cheek and lodged in his ear canal. Dan's ears were ringing and blood ran down his face, but he could still move. So Dan raised his left arm in a desperate attempt to protect himself. But the shooter didn't waste any time. They fired again, and this time the bullet broke Dan's glasses and lodged deep in his skull. At this point, Dan slumped forward. The shooter ran out of the garage, back to the Prius, threw the passenger door open, jumped into the car, and shouted for the driver to go, go, go. The driver gunned the engine, peeled out of the driveway, and sped off down the street. Minutes later, the killers drove out of the neighborhood and onto a highway heading south towards Miami. And when they were far enough from the crime scene, the driver made a phone call to a woman in South Florida and told her everything had gone according to plan. And then that woman hung up her phone and told her boyfriend, Charlie Adelson, that the job was done. It would take Detective Issam, the Tallahassee police, and members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation years to put all the puzzle pieces together, but they would come to believe that Wendy Adelson's brother, Charlie, had paid two hitmen roughly $100,000 to murder his sister's ex-husband. It would turn out that Wendy had no desire to share custody of the boys with Dan, and that she had even filed a motion with the court that would allow her to move with the boys 7 hours away to South Florida so she could be closer to her own family. But Dan had fought the motion, and the judge had ruled in his favor, and so Wendy was stuck in Tallahassee. As of now, police have never officially tied Wendy to Dan's murder, but her ex-boyfriend Jeff was key in turning their suspicions towards Wendy's brother Charlie. During his long-winded speech in the interrogation room, Jeff had said he didn't think Wendy would kill Dan, but he was almost sure Charlie would be up for it. That is what had stunned the investigator in the room with Jeff, as well as Issam, who was watching the interrogation via the camera outside. And it would turn out that when Jeff had gone to South Florida on a trip with Wendy to meet her family, Charlie had spent most of the time talking about how much he hated Dan, to the point that Jeff thought it was kind of bizarre and obsessive, and how Charlie also thought that Wendy should be allowed to live anywhere she wanted with her sons. And what had seemed even more bizarre was that Charlie had once made a joke to Wendy that he could just hire a hitman to kill Dan if he wanted to, and Charlie had implied he had enough money to basically do whatever he wanted and get away with it. And so Detective Issam started to think Dan's death might have been a murder for hire, and that Charlie had possibly arranged the murder from South Florida. So, with help from state law enforcement agencies, Issam had expanded the police search of surveillance footage to include cars that could possibly match the description Dan's neighbor had given and that had been driven up from South Florida into Tallahassee on the day of the murder. And surveillance footage from bus cameras, toll roads, and businesses led police to the light green Prius, which they were able to track from Miami all the way to the parking lot of Dan's gym as the Prius drove off and followed Dan home. The Prius turned out to be a rental car, and police traced it back to two men in Miami with criminal records. And one of those men would confess to the murder and make it known that he and his partner had a close connection to a woman who happened to be dating Wendy's brother, Charlie. The driver of the Prius was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. The man who pulled the trigger and killed Dan was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. The woman who was dating Charlie and who was believed to have directly recruited the killers was sentenced to life in prison as well, and Wendy's brother, Charlie Adelson, is awaiting a trial that is set to begin in October of 2023. And again, Wendy has never been officially linked to the murder of her ex-husband. And despite the promises that had been made at Dan's memorial service, Wendy and her family kept Dan's parents from seeing their grandchildren for years. But Dan's parents fought in court just like they thought their son would have, and in June of 2022, the Markle Act was signed into law, and it now protects grandparents and grandchildren from being kept apart when certain tragic events take place. In 2007, the now famous cult classic movie, Into the Wild, was released to movie theaters for the first time. The movie, which is based on a true story, centers on the life of a young man named Christopher McCandless. In 1990, Christopher graduated from a really good school with honors, and by all accounts, he could have gone on to get a really good, high-paying job, but Christopher didn't want a job. He wanted freedom. And so without telling his parents, because they would not have been happy about this idea, he gave away all of his possessions, he gave all his money to charity, and he headed off to Alaska to live off the grid by himself. He eventually would find this rusted out old city bus in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, and he would make this bus his shelter, and he would live inside of this bus for 113 days before he unfortunately died of starvation. While Christopher's story is obviously tragic, the movie about his life, Into the Wild, really focuses on Christopher's unrelenting spirit and his constant drive towards getting the thing he wants the most, which is freedom. And so at the end of this movie, the audience is left feeling not sad, but inspired. Inspired to take big risks in life and seek out adventure before it's too late. One audience member who was totally inspired by Christopher McCandless's life story was an 18-year-old young man named Matt Higgins who lived in Oregon. Matt was about to graduate high school, and unlike a lot of his peers, he had no idea what he should do after graduation, whether it was get a job or go to school. But after watching Into the Wild, a third option appeared to him, which was to head off into the wild, just like Christopher McCandless had done, except not permanently. Matt quickly fell in love with this option. He viewed it as a chance to kind of take a break from reality and go find himself, and then at the end of his stint in the wild, he could come back and, get a job or go to school. And so Matt's official Into the Wild plan was that he would graduate in 2007, and then in the spring of 2008, he would hike the entirety of the California section of the infamously rugged and beautiful Pacific Crest Trail. And he would do this all on his own. This section of the Pacific Crest Trail that he planned on hiking was roughly 1,700 miles long. It began on the border of Mexico in Southern California, and it wound its way north up to the border of Oregon. The trail cut through deserts and up and over mountains, and there was lots of dangerous wildlife to contend with. And on top of that, there were many points along this trail where hikers were very isolated. They were not anywhere near civilization, and so if anything were to happen to them, they'd be on their own. And so naturally, this hike was not a beginner hike. However, Matt was not a beginner hiker. He had grown up hiking and camping all over Oregon and the western United States. He had spent time in totally well-marked and safe areas, and he had also spent time hiking around very dangerous and isolated areas where there were cougars and bears and unmarked cliffs everywhere. And so Matt felt like, with his experience in the outdoors, he was perfectly suited to take on this big of an adventure. And in many ways, that was true. However, something was going to happen to him while he was out on the Pacific Crest Trail that no amount of hiking or camping experience could have prepared him for. So Matt graduated from high school in 2007, and in keeping with his plan, in the spring of 2008, he packed up his stuff, he headed to the airport, and he flew south to Southern California. And when he got there, he made his way all the way south to the border of Mexico, and there he picked up the start of the Pacific Crest Trail, and he began heading north. For the first few weeks of his hike, Matt would spend the entire day hiking as far as his body would allow him, and then at night, when it got too dark or when he got too tired, he would just set up his campsite right off the edge of the trail, and then after a quick bite to eat, he'd climb inside of his tent and he'd go to sleep. And then the next day, he'd get up early and he'd do it all over again. During those first few weeks, the only real adversity that Matt ever faced, beyond just kind of normal fatigue from long-distance hiking, was at one point he got a little dehydrated, and another time he almost stepped on a rattlesnake. So besides those two things, really the hike had actually been fairly routine by Matt's standards. But when he reached the Lassen National Forest, which is a very dense forest in Northern California, located about 150 miles from the end of his hike, so the border of Oregon, when he got there, this hike of his would become anything but routine. Not long after stepping foot in Lassen Forest, Matt found himself walking along this winding dirt path where the trees on both sides of this path were pressed tightly up against the edges of this trail, and because of how densely packed the trees were together, it was almost like he had these walls on either side of him that extended 100 feet into the air. And so it was very quiet and it was very dark as he was walking along, but Matt was enjoying it. All he could hear was the chirping of birds and the insects buzzing around him. It was peaceful. And so Matt's just kind of meandering his way through the forest. He's in no rush. And at some point, the trail he was on banked hard to the right. And so he makes this turn, and as he does, he looks up, and what he sees kind of startles him. About 20 feet away from him, off to the right side of the trail, is this big boulder, and sitting on this boulder are two middle-aged people, a man and a woman. They were both dressed head to toe in white. They both looked very dirty and disheveled. The man had this big, unkempt beard, and both of them were just staring daggers at Matt. And so Matt felt awkward, and he immediately looked down as he continued walking towards them. But as he got within a few feet, he looked up and kind of awkwardly smiled at them and waved and said hi, and they didn't respond. They just continued to stare at him with no discernible expression on their face, and they watched him as he walked right past them. And so after Matt walked past these two people in white, he felt really uncomfortable because he knew they were still definitely staring at him as he walked away, and he didn't want to turn around and meet their eye contact. And so he's just kind of walking away, feeling that uncomfortable feeling of someone staring at him, and he's thinking to himself, why didn't they at least wave or acknowledge him in some way? Especially considering the fact that on the Pacific Crest Trail, people go days without seeing other people. Matt, in fact, had not seen another person in days until he saw these two. And so he's thinking, how rude is that to just completely not react when another person walks past you on this trail? But Matt told himself, you know what? I don't know these people. I don't know what their issues are. For all I know, they're foreign and they didn't understand what I said. And so maybe that's why they didn't say hello back. Who knows? But you know what? It's none of my business. And so Matt just continued walking along. He never turned around to look back at these two people in white. He just carried on. A few hours later, when the sun was starting to set, Matt was still walking along this winding trail with these huge trees on either side of him, and so visibility was getting pretty poor, and so he began looking for a place to make his camp. But because of how close these trees were to the edge of this trail, and considering how dense these trees were, there was no spot for him to make his campsite without completely blocking the trail. And Matt did not want to block the trail for other people, and so what he did is he left the trail and he walked 300 feet or so into these thick trees where he found this little clearing, and that's where he set up his tent. Once it was all set up, he made some food for himself on his little stove, and then after he was done eating, he packaged up all of his leftover food inside of a waterproof bag. Then he sealed that up, and then he tied some cord to the bag and threw the bag up and over a branch of a nearby tree and kind of tied it off so the bag was sitting well off the ground. This was to make sure no bears could get to his food. And so after his leftovers were secured high up in a tree, it was totally pitch black outside, and so Matt just climbed into his tent, he zipped it up, climbed into his sleeping bag, and he fell asleep. The next morning, Matt got up right as the sun was starting to rise, and so it was still pretty dark outside, but there was a little bit of light. And so Matt unzipped his tent and he looked outside, and the first thing he noticed was his bag of food that he had put up in the tree was gone. And so Matt stepped out of his tent and he looked around thinking, maybe it fell to the ground or something, but it wasn't there. It was just gone. And so Matt thought to himself, I didn't hear anything last night, but I guess a bear must have come into the campsite, found the food, and run off with it. And so Matt began walking over to the tree where he had strung the food up to begin looking on the ground for bear prints to confirm his theory that that was who took his food. And so he walks over, he's looking around, he doesn't see any bear prints, but he does see 2 sets of human boot prints, neither of which were his. And before he could even process that, he realized these prints, these human prints, were not just underneath this tree where the food was. These prints, as he looked around him, extended all the way up to his tent and all around his tent and all over his campsite. And so as Matt is looking at this crazy trail of human prints all over the place, he's thinking to himself, how is this possible? I went to bed last night when it was already pitch black outside, and I got up basically right at sunrise, so it was still dark outside. So these 2 people that were walking all over my campsite and cutting my food down, they somehow navigated here 300 feet off the main trail in the middle of nowhere. They navigated here in total pitch blackness, and they did it silently without waking me up. How is that even possible? And so after running through this thought process, Matt realized the only logical conclusion was that the 2 people he saw on the rock, the people in white, had followed him after seeing him. They saw where he left the trail, and they had waited until he fell asleep and then snuck out and robbed him. As Matt's thinking about this, he suddenly realized that maybe they're still around. Maybe he's still being watched. And so he began whipping his head around, looking in all directions, almost expecting to see the man and the woman in white kind of poking out from behind a tree. But when he looked around, he couldn't see anyone. However, he started to get that sense that he was being watched. And so feeling really uncomfortable, he quickly packed up his campsite and walked as quickly and calmly as he could toward the trail. And as he walked, he kept thinking to himself that these people are going to jump out from behind a tree, or they're going to grab me from behind. And so he's walking faster and faster and faster. And he finally gets to the trail, and he looks down the trail and up the trail. He kind of looks all around. He doesn't see anybody. And so he tells himself, okay, they're gone. So he took a deep breath, he composed himself, and he started walking north again along the trail. Matt walked for several hours, periodically looking over his shoulder, again expecting to see the man and woman in white, but he never did, and eventually this narrow path kind of cutting through the dense forest opened up to this big, beautiful field, and by that point the sun was high in the sky, and so Matt's walking in this very beautiful open area. He can see in all directions, there's sunlight beaming down on him, and so even though he was totally rattled by what had happened the night before, he found himself kind of becoming more at ease about the situation. He was far less paranoid, and he began telling himself, as creepy as it is that those people in white almost certainly followed him and snuck up on his campsite in the middle of the night, as bad as that is, he thought, what? They probably were just super hungry, and they clearly needed the food more than he did, and so, what? Those people, they can have my food. Whatever. And so Matt just continued on telling himself he would never have to deal with the people in white ever again. However, he would be wrong. Over the next 3 days, Matt continued making his way north through the Lassen forest, and the trail he was on would weave between those big, beautiful open areas back inside those very densely forested areas where the trees were practically right on top of you. And during those 3 days, Matt did not see the people in white. He did not have any nighttime encounters with anybody. Nothing got stolen. And so that only reinforced the idea that, he had been a target of opportunity. They had taken what they wanted from him, and they were no longer following him. But on the 4th day after the food stealing incident, things would get spooky for Matt again. On that 4th night, Matt was once again forced to leave the trail he was on. He was in one of those very densely forested areas, and walk well off the trail to find a clearing for his tent. And so he walked, several hundred feet away. He finds this clearing. He sets up his tent. And then also he sets up a perimeter of sticks all around the outside of his campsite. This was a precaution he had begun taking after the food stealing incident. These sticks were an early warning system where if any animal or person came too close to his campsite, they would step, in theory, on these sticks and they would break and they would alert Matt in the middle of the night. And so after his campsite was all set up and all prepared, Matt sat down and had a quick bite to eat, and then after storing his food, he climbed inside of his tent and he fell asleep. Before we finish the story, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Are you tired of spending hours and hours in the kitchen preparing the perfect fermented walrus tail and cobra heart soup, only to be met with looks of disgust from your dinner guests? Hi, I'm MrBallen, and I had the same problem you did until I realized fermented walrus tail and cobra heart soup is just gross, and you should not be serving that to your dinner guests. Instead, serve them a meal from HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal service that sends actually good tasting food right to your doorstep. Between menu items like cheese stuffed burgers with pesto aioli and grilled salmon with balsamic tomatoes, you are bound to finally wow those finicky dinner guests at your next summer barbecue. And don't worry, HelloFresh recipes are very easy to follow, and they make for a joyful cooking experience for you and your family. Speaking of family, HelloFresh has a very popular kid-friendly line of recipes that are perfect for families looking to try something new while school is out for the summer. So if you're ready to finally stop jam-packing your fridge full of all those uneaten fermented walrus tails and cobra hearts, packing your fridge full of uneaten fermented walrus tails and cobra hearts, then you need to sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the story. A few hours later, Matt suddenly woke up. Now, when he woke up, he opened his eyes, but it's pitch black in his tent, there are no windows in his tent, and it's pitch black outside. So even with his eyes open, he can't see anything. And so he's just laying there with his eyes open, but it's total darkness, and he's just listening intently, because he doesn't really know why he woke up, if something startled him, or if there's no reason at all. And so he's just laying there and he's listening, and as he's listening, he hears the distinct sound of something stepping on one of the sticks in his perimeter. And so he hears the stick break and his heart just starts racing because he knows that an animal or a person is just a few feet away from him. And so instinctively, he kind of begins to pull his arm as quietly as he can out of his sleeping bag, and he reaches over and he grabs his hunting knife. And as he grabs the handle of the knife and he brings it closer to him, he hears the sound of more footsteps. Whatever has stepped on the stick has not slowed down at all. They don't care about the sound they just made. They're still moving towards his tent. And so Matt's starting to get really freaked out because he knows that, it could be an animal, but just a couple of days ago, 2 people were in his campsite stealing his food and walking all around his tent. And so that's what's going through his head. And so Matt's laying there preparing himself to potentially have to slash out if anybody came close to his tent. I mean, he's in the middle of nowhere. If a person is out here, it's not his friend. And so he's laying there, he's kind of shaking and he's listening really intently. And the footsteps are just getting closer and closer and closer to his tent until they stop right next to his head. They are literally about a foot away from him. And so he can't see anything. He's just listening really intently. And then he starts to hear whispering. But the whispering is not coming from this person right here. The whispering is coming from everywhere in the forest. It's coming from all different directions. And so Matt doesn't know what to think about this. And as he's hearing this whispering, which is getting more and more frantic, whoever is standing right outside of his tent begins circling his tent. So now he hears footsteps just walking in a circle around his tent while frantic whispers are coming in from all directions. And so at this point, Matt is so terrified, he's just frozen. He knows that he's holding that knife, but he won't be able to do anything with it. He's just petrified. And then as soon as this total nightmare had begun, it just stopped. The whispering, silence. The footsteps stopped. And so in a way, it was kind of relieving, but in another way, Matt's laying there thinking, I want to hear the sound of footsteps retreating into the forest, leaving, but I haven't heard that. It went from footsteps all around the tent and whispering everywhere to silence as if whoever is out there is still out there. And they're just standing there waiting for him. And because it's so dark, he can't even look. He can't look outside and see. And so he's left just laying in his tent, wondering if 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people are just waiting outside of his tent. He's got no idea. And so finally the sun would come up in the morning. And again, Matt has not heard the sound of retreating footsteps. And so maybe they're still just standing outside. But once the sun had totally come up and there was some light outside that he could see through his tent, Matt decided he just had to check. And so he reached over and he quickly unzipped the flap of the tent and he looked outside. He didn't see anyone. He leapt outside with his knife, ready to confront anyone who was out there, but there was no one. And so Matt, he's not thinking, oh, great, they're gone. He's thinking, are they just like a few feet away, hiding behind trees? And so for a few minutes, Matt just began looking all around his campsite, kind of expecting to see, those people in white or other people he doesn't know, but he doesn't see anyone. And then Matt starts thinking to himself, was this just a nightmare? Did that not even happen? Am I imagining this? But when he looked down, he saw clear boot prints all over his campsite, including a nice track all the way around his tent. And so this nightmare really had played out in real life. And so he quickly gets everything back into his pack, he throws it on his shoulder, and he just starts running back towards the trail. And when he got to the trail, he continued running north. And as he's running along and looking over his shoulder the whole time, he's telling himself, I just need to get out of Lassen National Forest. I need to get out of the people in white's turf, get away from this place, and I'll be left alone. And so that motivated him to spend the whole day moving as fast as he possibly could. And by that afternoon, he had finally escaped Lassen National Forest. He was out and he was in one of these smaller towns that kind of butted up alongside this forest. And so that night, he camped out right near this town. He wanted to be as close to civilization as possible to ensure his safety. And so as he's laying in his tent that night, he began thinking about what had happened over the past couple of days. At this point, he was nearly certain that the people in white that he had seen on that boulder, they had to be behind these nighttime encounters. They just had to be. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, well, the first encounter I had with them, when they stole his food, yeah, that's creepy, but it makes sense. They followed him, they went to his campsite, they stole his food. Okay, fine. That makes sense to him. But the second encounter, the one that had happened the night before, That didn't make any sense. Assuming it was, again, the people in white responsible, that meant they had been following Matt the whole time, and he had not seen them somehow, even though over the last couple of days, he had been looking over his shoulder constantly, looking for those people, but he didn't see them, and they still managed to follow him all the way over several days to this other unmarked campsite, hundreds of feet off the main trail. So how did they do that? And then two, once they were at his campsite and he's laying there listening to them, walking around the campsite, whispering to each other, what were they doing? And then how did the footsteps and whispering just stop immediately and he didn't even hear the sound of them retreating into the woods? How did they do that? And so Matt would go over this and over this until finally he would fall asleep. And then the next morning when he got up, it was the first thing he was thinking about, the people in white. What were they doing and why and where were they? And so as Matt packed up his campsite that morning, it did cross his mind, that maybe he should just stop the hike right now and call his family, have them come pick him up and get out of here. But this hike, this huge hike he had planned, was really important to him, and he was only about 100 miles away from the finish line, which meant he had already hiked over 1,600 miles, and he just didn't want to quit. He wanted to finish what he started. And so he packed up his stuff, he threw it over his shoulder, and he continued on. And so that day, Matt would leave that little town, and he would make his way up into another very dense forest called the Mount Shasta forest. Mount Shasta was a lot like the Lassen forest, except Mount Shasta has a very disturbing backstory. Specifically, lots and lots of people go missing inside of Mount Shasta, and often they go missing under baffling circumstances. The most frightening of these missing persons reports are when someone comes back, the survivor of the event, and they will say, they saw their hiking companion. They clearly saw them. And then they turned their back on them just for a few moments, few minutes, whatever it was. And when they turned back around, the person they were with was now gone. No trace of them, nothing. They're just gone. And despite a massive search for them, they're never found again. There is a distressing number of missing people in Mount Shasta that sound just like that. It's totally terrifying. So with that in mind, Matt makes his way into the Mount Shasta forest, and even though it totally stressed him out to once again be walking on these dirt pathways where the trees are very tight on either side of you, they're very dense, and as he's walking, he's kind of looking in both directions, expecting to see somebody watching him. Despite feeling that way, Matt just continued to stay focused and kept telling himself to just continue on because you're so close to the end. And so the first 3 days that he was in the Mount Shasta forest, Matt would just keep his head down and very stoically every day, he would just hike as far as he possibly could. In the evening, he would set up his campsite either right off the trail or maybe a little ways off the trail in a clearing. And he didn't have any run-ins with the people in white or anybody else for that matter. He was totally left alone. But on his 4th day in the Mount Shasta forest, all that would change. On that 4th day, Matt found himself not inside one of those very dense forested areas, but rather in this very open trail that was up on the side of this mountain. And because this trail was fairly high up in elevation, the tree coverage was fairly sparse, and so there was great visibility. He could see miles ahead of him, and when he turned around, he could see miles behind him. And so Matt is just walking along this trail, kind of enjoying the day. It's beautiful outside. And at some point, he turns around and looks behind him. Now, all day he'd been doing that, and he had not seen anyone. But this time, when he turned around, he saw 2 little white dots, miles and miles back, slowly making their way along the trail that he was on. It was the people in white. They were back. At this point, Matt was at least 50 miles or more away from that first place he had walked past the people in white when they were sitting on that boulder, which meant, 1, Matt was right. These people in white really had followed him and almost certainly were responsible for the nighttime visits he was getting. And 2, for reasons unknown, they were still following him. Matt suddenly didn't care at all about completing his big hike. He just wanted to get the heck away from those people. And so very quickly he pulled out his map and he looked, and to his horror, he realized he was in one of the most isolated portions of the entire hike. He was at least 25 miles away from the nearest civilization, a little town called Castella, California. And so without a better option, Matt put the map back in his pocket. He took one last look at the people in white who were making steady gains on him, and then Matt just turned away from them and began booking it down the trail. And Matt would run for hours and hours and hours without stopping. Even when he turned around and could no longer see the people in white, he just kept on running. And then when the sun set and he could barely see the trail, he just kept on running. It literally wasn't until it was so dark outside that he actually couldn't see the ground anymore that Matt finally, totally exhausted, came to a stop. And then from there, he turned and left the trail and walked way away from the trail, hundreds of feet deep into the forest, to get as far away from these people in white as he possibly could. And so finally, he found this clearing very far away from the trail. He set up his tent right in the middle of it, and then he very diligently laid out his perimeter of sticks around his campsite, making sure there were no gaps. And then he climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up, and then keeping on all of his stuff in case he needed to make a run for it, he got inside of his sleeping bag and he just laid there with no expectation that he was going to sleep. He was terrified. As he laid there, he thought to himself, okay, I have now run at least several miles ahead of them. I know that was them. I know I got some distance on them. There's no way they saw where I turned off the trail and where I've set up this campsite, so they can't possibly find me. And so Matt would lay in the tent for several hours just waiting to fall asleep. And then finally he would start to get tired because at this point it's totally quiet outside. He hasn't heard anything. And so he begins to doze off to sleep. And as he's getting more and more tired, he hears the sound of someone stepping on his perimeter of sticks. And as soon as he hears that stick break, he hears the all too familiar whispering pick up all around the forest. And then something new happens. Before Matt can even do anything, his tent lights up like a Christmas tree. Someone is shining a light on his tent. Someone has snuck up on his campsite in the middle of nowhere, hundreds and hundreds of feet off the trail, in the middle of the night. They've found him, and they're shining a light on him. And then the light clicks off, and it's silent. And at this point, Matt's fight or flight instinct kicks in, and he rips off his sleeping bag, he jumps outside and begins screaming nonsense and flailing around with the knife, trying to intimidate these people to get away from him. And then after he stops for a second, he hears a stick crunch right behind him. And he whips his head around to look at who is standing right behind him. And as he's turning out of his peripheral vision, he sees a dark figure running towards him. He doesn't think twice, he just turns and begins running away from the campsite. Now remember, it's pitch black in the forest. There's trees everywhere. And so Matt's smashing into trees, branches are hitting him, he's falling to the ground, but he is on a pure adrenaline high, and he is just sprinting as fast as he possibly can away from this person who is likely still chasing him. And after 5 minutes of running, he stumbles and falls forward and kind of lands at the base of this fallen tree. The tree had landed in such a way that it was kind of propped on a rock. So there was a small gap underneath the tree. And so Matt, thinking quickly, kind of slid himself underneath this log and positioned himself so he was looking back in the direction he was running from. And as he laid there, he saw in the distance this light bobbing around. These people are looking for him. They're searching the forest for him. And so he watched in horror, tucked underneath this log, as whoever had the light and whoever else was with them, they moved closer and closer and closer, but they did not find him tucked underneath the log. They just walked right on past him. And so Matt would remain underneath this log all night until finally the sun came up. And at that point, even though it was fairly obvious that whoever was looking for him, they were now gone, Matt was still terrified. And so he stayed under the log for several hours until it was about early afternoon. And then he finally pulled himself out from under the log and he looked around. He couldn't see anyone. And then instead of going back to his campsite and getting his gear, he just totally abandoned it. He was worried that these people in white or whoever it was, that they were still going to be there. And so he just turned and continued running away from his campsite back out to the trail. And once he got the trail, he continued running on the trail all the way to Castella, California. And when he got there, he hitchhiked his way to the town of Mount Shasta. And there he would speak to police as well as the Forestry Service about what he had experienced. And so they would take all of his information down and they would put him up in a motel for the night. And then the next day, Matt would get in touch with his family and they would drive from Oregon to Mount Shasta. They would pick him up and they would take him back home. Months later, Matt would contact the Mount Shasta Police and the Forest Service and would just follow up and say, hey, have you learned anything else about these people in white? Have you caught them? Has anybody else come forward? And the police would say, they did have a number of people coming forward saying that things had been stolen from their campsites. These are people that were in Mount Shasta, in Lassen Forest, and the surrounding forests. But Matt was the only one who had reported being terrorized by this mysterious couple in white. And so to this day, Matt has no idea who those two people were, what they wanted with him, beyond obviously the food they took. I mean, they continued to stalk him for nearly 100 miles. And he has no idea how they were able to keep finding his campsites that were hundreds of feet off the main trail in unmarked areas that they would somehow navigate to in total darkness without alerting Matt. It's all a big mystery.